Okay, that's better. My microphone had become muted for some reason. So I'm getting a thumbs up from the back of the room. So good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to this session from Visual Impact in Teddington. My name's Alister, and in this session, we're going to be looking at this lot here, Sony's Cinema Line. And the idea behind this session really is to try to understand which camera you might use for what application. So this is hopefully going to be a nice interactive session. I keep glancing over here because I have my laptop and I can see the chat room for the stream. So do please ask any questions that you have at any point. And the whole point of doing this way is that we can, hopefully I can answer those questions and you can get those questions answered rather than perhaps watching the session, getting to the end of it and thinking, I really wanted to know blah, blah, blah. So do start typing away with those questions as soon as you have them. A couple of little things. So Visual Impact, they are an equipment dealer and a rental facility in the UK. And one of these things, and I say this every time, I've had a relationship with Visual Impact that goes back decades actually. And it's something that I recommend everybody tries to build at some point, is a relationship with an equipment dealer. Very often these days you can go online and you can use Google to find the lowest price and you can buy your equipment just with a few clicks of a mouse without ever talking to anybody. But something I learned the other day is actually those online prices that you see on a website aren't always the cheapest. And sometimes it is better to pick up the phone and talk to a dealer and say, hey, can you do me a better deal than that? And by having that relationship with a dealer, by talking to the dealer, should something go wrong with your equipment at any point, you'll know who to contact, who to talk to, and they can perhaps put you together equipment bundles, which you can't really do online. So maybe a camera plus a tripod or some batteries and other accessories, and that might all work out cheaper. And of course, that dealer can then keep you up to date with any new equipment releases, things like that, and provide wonderful events like this where you can learn about the equipment that you have purchased. So enough about the waffle. Let's get on with the show, as they say. So Sony Cinema Line, it comprises a lot of cameras now. So, excuse me, we have the Venice 2 and Venice cameras, and they are really your sort of high-end digital cinema cameras. Those cameras you're most likely going to use for feature film production, and there are a lot of features now being shot on the Venice cameras, a really huge amount actually. It's gaining immense popularity because of its combination of very high resolution, very high dynamic range, big range of scan modes. So if you want to shoot Super 35 with traditional cinema lenses, you can, or you can shoot anamorphic with 3x2 scan mode and 1.8 times anamorphics and all the modern stuff. So Venice is finding a very, very good place for itself in that high-end production. And it's not just film and cinema production. It's also now being used for high-end documentary production, as well as a limited amount of live production. So big music events and things like that, where they want that shallow depth of field look. But we do have to acknowledge that the Venice camera is a very expensive camera. You're looking at £50,000 for the basic camera. And then by the time you've spec'd it up with the different licenses, viewfinders, and all the other options that you want, you're probably looking at something in the region of £70,000 plus. And that is a rather expensive proposition. And because of that, it does tend to be a little bit more limited to high-end production. And the other thing about the Venice camera, actually, you can kind of see it in this picture here, is that it's actually designed for two-man operation. So the main control panel, where you do most of your settings changes and things like that, are on the off side of the camera, away from the camera operator. And that's so that the first AC, the camera assistants, can see that control panel and operate that control panel while the camera is on the operator's shoulder or perhaps on a dolly or something like that. So it's very much a camera designed for two-man or crewed operation. Now, I have shot with Venice single-handed, and you can do it. and you can get some lovely results with the camera using it that way, but it is tricky. And I did admittedly find it frustrating if I wanted to switch between scan modes, perhaps to go between different frame rates at different resolutions. I had to actually go around to the other side of the camera to actually make that change. So Venice is very much targeted at crude operations, generally larger budget productions and things like that. So let's go back to the slide here. And if we look then at the next camera down, I'm just going to give a quick overview before I go into a lot of depth. We have the Sony FX9. Now, I don't have one here in front of me today, but the FX9 is generally a camera that's used for television news production. It's a very versatile camera. It has a full frame sensor, as do almost all of these cameras. This one here, which is the FX30, which I'll come on to in a bit, is the only Cinema Line camera that doesn't have a full frame sensor. All the others do. So the FX9 has a full frame sensor, and that sensor is a 6K sensor. So it's 6K resolution at full frame. And what that means is that as well as shooting in full frame, that camera can shoot in Super 35. And when you crop into that 6K sensor, it becomes a 4K sensor at Super 35, and it's 4K of pixels. And that allows you to shoot 4K at either full frame or 4K at Super 35. And that makes it very versatile. It means you can use a lot of classic PL cinema lenses, which are all designed around Super 35 with it. And it's a really very flexible camera. You can put the XDCA dock on the back of the camera, and that gives you the ability then to stream live using Sony's QoS streaming platform. And by streaming live with QoS, you can do live television news very reliably. So QoS as a streaming format has a lot of error correction, and it can adjust its bit rate depending on the streaming environment. And the XDCA that goes on the back of the FX9 has 2 slots in the top for a couple of USB sticks for 4G and 5G connectivity. So it really does make it a very versatile package, and that's why it's very popular with news companies in particular for doing television news, and also popular with documentary producers and people like that that might need a lot of lens flexibility to use different lenses. The FX9 also has a 2K scan mode, so one of the things that you can do more easily with the FX9 than the other cameras in the Cinema Line is use 2/3" b4 lenses. And there are various adapters that you can put on the front of the FX9 to use 2/3" ENG lenses. And the big benefit that you generally get with those lenses is a very big zoom range. Now, if you do put a 2/3" zoom lens on the FX9, then generally the image quality isn't perhaps quite as good. It's not as nice, not as pleasing as if you're using a cinema style lens or even a photo type lens, just because of some of the limitations of those lenses. So you don't get perhaps that cinema style look, but you do get the ability to use a very big zoom range. And again, this is why the FX9 tends to be a camera used by TV news and TV news producers. So do ask those questions if you have any. Moving on down the line, the next camera I'm going to look at is, very quickly at least, is the FX6. So the FX6 is this camera here. And this is an immensely popular camera. For a long time, it was actually very difficult to get hold of them. It was so popular, but now supply is not a problem. And I think one of the reasons why this camera is so popular is it's a very good jack of all trades camera, and it's at a very good price point. So I think currently it's around about the £6,000 mark. So again, at the front here, we have a full frame sensor. But unlike the FX9, this is now just a 4K full frame sensor. So that introduces some limitations in so much as basically it is only a full frame camera. So if you don't want to shoot HD, if you want to just shoot in 4K, this is pretty much full frame only, because if you do crop into that 4K sensor, you'll have less than 4K resolution. Now you can shoot HD with it in its Super 35 mode. And there is a bit of a cheat that you can use by shooting with the camera in the full frame 4K mode and using something called clear image zoom in the camera. And this camera has clear image zoom. The FX30 has clear image zoom, and the FX3 has clear image zoom, to zoom in past the crop and the vignette that you'll get with a Super 35 lens. The camera will still be in its 4K mode, but you will still be using less of the sensor. So you won't get 4K resolution. Your resolution will be less than 4K. But that's a mode that quite a lot of people do shoot with to get around that issue of the camera not really being designed to use Super 35 lenses. It records on CF Express type A cards and SD cards. So if you're using SD cards, you have very low cost media, very cheap media. So that makes it lower cost overall. The cost of ownership is reduced compared to the FX9, which uses XQD cards, and XQD cards are fairly expensive and need special readers and things like that, whereas an SD card, most laptops, most computers have readers for those cards. It can shoot at 120 frames per second in 4K, which is immensely popular with users and owners of this camera. We do have a lot of professional features, like a couple of XLR inputs on the side here for professional audio. In fact, one of the things I've just realized is I don't have the hand grips that come with these cameras, certainly come with the FX3 and is an option for the FX30. And that does give you an XLR input on these smaller cameras if you need it. And just generally overall, the FX6 though, it's obviously a professional looking camera. It looks like a pro camera. It's that bit bigger than these cameras. And if you are mounting a lot of accessories, that's a big deal. Being able to have space for a monitor, perhaps for a time code box, a video transmitter, things like that, it's actually much easier on this camera. And the batteries that it takes are Sony's BPU batteries. They're like, this is a BPU 60, and there's a smaller one, a 35 as well. And this battery will run the camera for about 2.5 hours, maybe even a bit more than that when it's new. And that gives you the reassurance that you can put a battery in the camera and it will run for a very, very long time before you have to change that battery. And I think that's one of the things, again, with these cameras that's attractive to professional users is larger batteries. And it's relatively easy to run it off a V-mount battery if you want. You do need a power adapter because this camera is a 19.5 volt camera, but they're readily available now and you can buy adapters to run this camera very easily off a V-mount battery, put that on a plate or an adapter on the back, and then that helps with the balance of the camera as well, putting a bit more weight on the back. And you have a nice big viewfinder with a hood that's reasonably viewable in bright sunlight. The hood makes a big difference. And again, there are options with this camera, excuse me, with third-party accessories to add a support system to this. So you can put a loop or a magnifier on here to turn it into an enclosed viewfinder. So this is a very popular choice with shooting professionals. Now, as we come down that line, so in fact, before we come down the line, we'll go slightly sideways on the line, and the camera that's right on the end of the display here, the FR7, I don't have one here. We did a session on the FR7 last week, in fact, and the FR7 is in essence the Sony FX6, this camera, in a pan, tilt, and zoom housing. So it allows you to remotely control the camera. So you can pan, tilt, zoom, and fully control the camera remotely via an Ethernet cable. And one of the things I did recently with that camera was to shoot circus with the FR7. And I'm just going to show you a little video now. So actually we'll have a look at a video that I shot with the FR7. So let me just cue that video up for you quickly. I thought I had it queued up ready, but here we go. So just bear with me a second. So this is just playing off my laptop, so it might might be a little stuttery and juddery perhaps, but this was shot with the FR7. The performers did 4 acts, and I filmed it 4 times to get the different camera angles. One time on the floor, right at the very front of the performing area. Another time with it high in the rigging above the performing area. And then I did the same again, the low shot and the high shot, but shooting predominantly at 120 frames per second. So like the FX6, the FR7 can shoot from 24 frames per second all the way up to 120 frames per second, so you can have slow motion. It records internally on SD cards or the CF Express Type A cards, and that allows you to have great flexibility in what you shoot and how you shoot. And controlling the camera, I was actually controlling it using my laptop because there is a web application or a web server built into the camera, and that allows you to view a preview of what you're shooting and control the camera from any device with a web browser. So that could be a tablet or a laptop or a computer. So I was sat in the back of the audience in the Circus Big Top and controlling the camera using the virtual joystick on the laptop. And I could then see and preview exactly the shots that I was getting. And it allowed me to get some really unique and quite interesting shots. There's no way you could be up in the rigging in the top of a Circus Big Top tent during a live circus performance, or not easily. Having said that, I have done it on a couple of occasions. A lot of people comment on these shots with the lasers as wasn't I worried about damaging the camera, and frankly, yes, I was, but the laser engineer reassured me that he knew all about sensor damage and everything else, and the lasers were set up so that there would not be any risk of damage. So I did a test actually with my phone and some other cameras first before I shot the FR7, and it was all fine and it worked great. But just a word of caution is when shooting lasers, is that if the laser hasn't been set up correctly so that it won't damage a camera, it can damage your sensor in your camera instantly. There's no warning. There's no like, well, I'm going to test to see if it works, because if it doesn't work, it's going to actually damage the sensor instantly. There's no sort of progressiveness about it. It just will wreck your sensor very quickly. So that is something to be aware of. So the FR7, as I say, basically the FX6 in the pan, tilt and zoom housing. So then we come to these smaller cameras, and we have here in front of me, I have the FX3, and then I also have the FX30, and these are both very, very similar cameras. Most of what they do is the same. There are actually a few things that the FX30 can do that the FX3 can't. But then there are also some things a little bit different. So the essentially very similar cameras. The key difference, though, is that the FX3 is a 4K full frame sensor, and the FX30 has a 6K Super 35 sensor. So the FX3 sensor is essentially the same sensor that's in the FX6. Another difference with the FX3 is the FX6 has built-in ND filters, and those are immensely useful when you're shooting in very variable light conditions. The FX3 doesn't. So you're going to, shooting outdoors, you're going to want an ND filter in front of the lens, and that does add extra fiddle factor, extra complexity. I do find it much easier to use the built-in ND filters of the FX6 than I do using perhaps a variable ND filter or different ND filters on the front of the lens with the FX3. And the other thing that the FX3, though, that the FX3 has that the FX6 doesn't, is the FX3 has IBIS, so that's in-body image stabilization. So the sensor itself actually moves as you move the camera, and that helps reduce wobble and shake in your footage. The FX6 doesn't have that because it has built-in ND filters. The FX3 doesn't have the built-in ND filters, so having in-body stabilization is much easier to do. The FX30 also has IBIS, in-body stabilization. But with this camera, what we have is a Super 35 size sensor, so actually it's APS-C, but that's virtually the same as Super 35. It's a 6K sensor, and that 6K is downsampled to 4K. So all of these cameras, the maximum they record is 4K, including the FX9. So the FX9 with that 6K sensor still only records a 4K as a maximum resolution, downsamples. I really like actually the way the footage from the FX30 looks. The way it's downsampled from 6K to 4K means that you get a very nice, very sharp, very highly detailed image without it looking over-processed or anything like that. And one of the things that I really like about the FX30 is that I can use this particular lens. And this is Sony's 18 to 105 millimeter f4 power zoom. So from this little rocker button here on the front of the camera, I can zoom in and zoom out. There's also a zoom rocker on the side of the lens, going from 18 millimeter, which is reasonably wide, with a camera, a Super 35 camera. Let me tell you what. Let's put the camera up so you can see what that lens does. I'm being a little impatient there, so I'm just waiting for the camera to turn on and to feed the HDMI. So this is the standard output. This has got my overlays and everything else. So there's my wide end, the 18 to 35, and then I can zoom in with the power zoom. And I think I'm in manual focus at the moment. Let me see. No, I am in auto. I don't know why it's not focusing. Not sure why that's not focusing. But it really does give me a huge range of focal lengths. I'll tell you what, Now, it's a little tricky for me to work out what's going on here because I'm outputting via the HDMI, so I'm not seeing the overlays on the LCD. So this is actually one of the limitations of this camera. So if I just go into the menu here, you'll see that on the external output, I have to choose whether I have the info display on or off on the LCD screen. Now, when I have the info display, the overlays that you're seeing now, looking at like this, so you can see the overlays, I can't see them on the LCD, and that makes things a little bit more difficult when you're using an external monitor, or as in this case, I'm sending the output to the vision mixer for the stream. Now, if I turn this off, you're going to see the camera's output full frame. So instead of seeing the stuff with all the overlays on, you're now seeing the full frame output. And now I can see all my controls and everything else on the screen. So just looking at my autofocus settings here quickly, and why I'm not getting AF at the moment. Let's have a quick look. Is I am set to face priority, but I'm not sure why. Right, okay, that's why. I'm being a complete muppet here. The camera is actually in photo mode, so not video mode. All right, so if I put the camera in its dedicated video mode, that's better. So now we have autofocus that's working. And now I can zoom in and out. And this is the 18 to 105. And you can see the range that gives you. And I can do a nice slow zoom, or I can do a much faster zoom like that. And the other thing that I'm actually using here is clear image zoom. So let me bring on the overlays again so you can see what I'm doing. Just bear with me. All right, so you can see I've got the overlays back on now. So I'm using clear image zoom. And of course, I should have realized that most of my overlays are now outside of the image area. So as I zoom in, you'll see that I zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. And then we go into clear image zoom. So once we sorry, the lens is the 18 to 105. Once we go past 105 millimeter, clear image zoom takes over, and it's actually fairly seamless. So that last bit, that last extra 1.5 times is digital. And as I zoom out, there's a little bump just there as we go from clear image zoom to the actual servo zoom, but it does extend the zoom range that you've got quite nicely. And it's a feature I do use quite a bit, because if you do need that extra zoom range, it really does help you. So this is the FX30, and I really like this little camera, funnily enough. If you want to shoot in very, very low light, the FX3 and the FX6 are definitely more sensitive. They have a bigger sensor with bigger pixels, and that really does help in very low light levels. But the FX30 actually is still not a bad performer in low light. And there's lots of little things that I really like about this camera. And it's kind of my, if I'm traveling, if I'm going away, going somewhere where I just want to take one camera and be very versatile and very flexible, the FX30 is actually my go-to camera with this lens. Now, of course, being an E-mount lens, you can use other lenses on it as well. And something I shot recently with this camera was the theatre and circus at Glastonbury. So every year I go to the Glastonbury Festival and I shoot the theatre and circus fields. And the main part of that is the big top tent, where we have all sorts of different amazing circus acts from all over the world that come and perform in that circus tent. And this year we actually produced some content for the BBC, for their BBC shows about Glastonbury. And they wanted to show the setup, what goes on behind the scenes of preparing the big top, putting all the rigging up for all the different high wire acts and things like that, and then show some of those acts. And I was actually given the loan of some Sirui Nighthawk lenses, and they're T1.2 prime lenses. So they're very, very fast lenses. There's a 24, a 35, and a 55 millimeter. And they're a really nice match for this camera. And I used them to shoot some of the preparation and the build up inside the big top, because before all the lighting is completed and the preparation is done, some of it takes place when there are public allowed into the Glastonbury Festival site. So all the flaps and everything else on the tent have to be kept closed to keep the public out. So it's very, very dark in there. So I shot a little video with those lenses with the FX30. So let me just cue that up for you, and we can have a look at that. So let's have a look at this video. So this is FX30 shot in the circus big top with the prime lenses, the 1.2 millimeter primes, and I think it looks really, really nice. So don't be, just because the camera isn't full frame, I don't really see that as being a major concern. And having those prime lenses, they've got a really nice focus throw and everything else on them for really good pull focuses is really good. Low level light is not an issue, and you really do get that nice sort of film-like look, even with a Super 35 camera. Don't get me wrong, I am a big fan of full frame, and obviously full frame isn't something that's going to go away. But I do also like Super 35 because it allows you to access a lot of the classic cinema lenses that were designed for PL mount that have been around for a very, very long time. So having a camera that can shoot Super 35 is really, really nice. And for me, as I already have the FX6, the FX30 is actually a really nice pairing, a really nice combination, because I can use the FX30 for Super 35, PL mount lenses with an adapter, things like that. And then if I want to shoot full frame, I've got the FX6 and I can shoot full frame with the FX6. Now, in terms of dynamic range and things like that, comparing the FX30 to the FX3 and the FX6, I tested this extensively. Now, Sony say that the FX30 is 14 plus stops, and they say that the FX3 is 15 plus stops. Now, when I checked and compared them, I really couldn't find any significant difference in the dynamic range between the 30 and the 3 and the 6. I found them to all be almost exactly the same. So from a practical shooting point of view, I really don't think you're losing anything in the dynamic range stakes with the FX30. But as I say, it's a smaller sensor, it's an APS-C sensor, it has 6K pixels, so the pixels are smaller. So ultimately, in very, very low light situations, the FX3 and the FX6 will perform better. And one of the things that I do very regularly is every year I go up to Norway to shoot the Northern Lights. And the Northern Lights are something that really, really isn't at all bright. They are very faint and very, very dim. So my go-to camera for shooting the Northern Lights is the FX3. That bigger sensor with bigger pixels does mean it performs exceptionally well at very low light levels. It has 2 ISOs and 2 sensitivities. And in fact, actually, that's something to discuss right now, looking at all of these cameras. And if we include the FX9, all of these cameras, including Venice, have 2 sensitivities or 2 different base ISOs. So Venice uses a dual base ISO system, where at the low base ISO, which on Venice 2 is 800, and on Venice 1 is 500 ISO, Venice 2 high base ISO is 800, Venice is 3200 ISO, Venice 2's high base ISO is 2500. But whether you're at the high or the low base, there is no difference in dynamic range. And there is only the very tiniest of difference in noise, and that's considered to be what Sony called dual base ISO. The FX9 is also dual base ISO, and its base ISOs are 800 and 4000. And actually that split, 800 to 4000, I find very useful for a lot of more sort of film style shooting. 800 is now the standard that most digital cinematography cameras have, whether that's from Sony, from Arri, from Red, from whatever. And all of the Cinema Line, with the exception of Venice 1, have an 800 ISO base. Then the FX9's 4000 ISO, that second base, is about 3 stops above the lower base. So it's actually a reasonable difference. It's two and a bit stops. And that allows you to shoot at lower light levels, even with a lit set or something like that, without having to put in ND filters or use strange exposure indexes. 4000 ISO is a really handy base ISO to have. The FX30 is also considered to be dual base ISO, and its base ISOs are 800 and 2500, I think, off the top of my head. And again, it's a reasonable split. That 2500 is very useful. It is a little bit more noisy at 2500 than it is at 800, but that noise difference at the base ISO isn't significantly different. Now, the FX6 and the FX3, they are a little bit different. So these both have a base ISO when you're shooting with S-Log3 of 800, and then their second base ISO for S-Log3 is 12,800 ISO, and that's a huge gap between those two bases. And at 12,800 ISO, they are definitely more noisy than they are at 800. And Sony don't call this dual base ISO, they just call it dual sensitivity or dual ISO. And the thing is that the 2 base ISOs are not totally interchangeable. When you go up to 12,800, it is a little bit, it's definitely more noisy. And it's also, there's a slight reduction in dynamic range. It's very slight, but there is a reduction in the dynamic range. And what that tends to mean is that if I'm shooting with log, is I won't use the base exposure index. So when I go to 12,800 base ISO, instead of using 12,800 EI, which matches the base ISO, I tend to use either 6,400 or 3,200 to get a lower noise image. With the FX30, with the Venice, with the FX9, I can use the higher base ISO and the matching EI and get a usable image. With the FX6, there is definitely, and the FX3 as well, considerably more noise at that higher base sensitivity. But having said that, having that extra sensitivity really does make these cameras excel at shooting in exceptionally low light. So if you are shooting a moonlight scene or something like that, the FX6 or the FX3 would be my go-to camera every time. And it really does perform wonderfully, wonderfully well shooting at very, very low light levels, especially if you pair it up with a very fast lens. At the moment on my FX3, I actually have Sony's 24 to 240 millimeter lens on here. This is a lens that is not often talked about, but actually I find it very useful. It gives me a tremendous zoom range. It's a 10 times zoom range, going from 24 to 240 millimeters. I tell you what, let's plug this one into the output so you can see what that gives me. So just bear with me a second. And let's bring the camera up. There we go. So this is 24 to 240 millimeters. So I can go from 24, which on a full frame sensor is pretty wide, and then I can zoom all the way into 240 millimeters there, and that goes pretty long. And it is a stabilized lens as well. Now the aperture does vary. So at the longest end there, my largest aperture is f6.3. And as I zoom all the way out to here, it becomes 3.5. So there is a difference. If I zoom in now, you'll see that the aperture will stop down. But I can get this tremendous, tremendous zoom range, which is really, really useful for a lot of applications. And we can also add the 1.5 times clear image zoom in on the end of that if you really want to go very tight. And if I'm doing something that's really very, very sort of run and gun, so when I go up to Norway and I shoot the Northern Lights, we often go out and about exploring the area on snowmobiles and things like that. And this allows me just to take one lens to get a tremendous range of shots. I mean, sometimes we might see reindeer off in the distance or elk and things like that, and having a 240 millimeter lens with 1.5 times clear image zoom on the end of that, taking you to the equivalent of like 350 millimeters, is very beneficial. The fact that the aperture steps down, yeah, it's sad, it's a shame, but the flexibility that this gives me is tremendous. The other thing that I do every year is I go storm chasing, I go to the States, and this tends to be the main lens that I'll have on the camera most of the time, because when you jump out of the car to shoot the storm, you might not have very long to capture that footage. You might only have a few minutes. And I find it really good to have this lens on the camera by default, because 24 millimeter on full frame is reasonably wide, and then 240 at the other end is quite a long lens. So I can get some shots very quickly. I might then change to another lens, perhaps a 24 to 70, the faster 2.8 lens, something like that, once I've got a few shots in the can under my belt, to get some nicer shots at f2.8, or if light levels are low, to go to a faster lens. But this tends to be the lens that lives on the camera, so that the moment I jump out of the car, I can at least get some shots recorded before I then fine-tune the focal lengths that I'm going to use to get the really nice shots. It's not that expensive. I think it's about £800 or £900 if I'm not mistaken at the moment, and it is a Sony G series lens, which is where mid-range quality lens. And I really actually use this lens a lot. So just to give you an idea then of low light performance, let's have a look at another video. So let me just queue up a video from Norway, and we can have a look at that. So this is shot primarily with the FX3, and most of this is actually, just make sure this is the right video. Yeah, so this is shot with a mixture actually of the FX3 and the FX30. So let's have a look. So a lot of this daytime footage was shot with the FX30 using the 18 to 105mm power zoom. And the footage looks really quite reasonable. It's a G series lens, so it's a mid-range quality lens. We get some very challenging light up there in Norway, very bright skies, very dark foregrounds. This was in January, it's about -30 degrees, so it's very, very cold. And the days are very, very short. The sun comes up at about, well, the first couple of days, the sun didn't actually rise at all. And by the end of the week-long trip, the sun's coming up at about 11 o'clock in the morning and then setting again at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, this shot here was actually done with the FX30, and this is time-lapse. I used a Ronin, Ronin 2, RS2, to do the camera move, and then this is time-lapse, shooting a roughly 1 second exposure, 1 frame every second. And when you shoot time-lapse, you can actually afford to use the lower sensitivity when the aurora is quite bright like this and get a nice shot. Now, this shot is done with the FX3. Now, this is video now, so this is not time-lapse anymore. This is video of the Northern Lights shot in real time. So this is a much, much shorter exposure. Typically, this will be a 1/24th of a second exposure, so I'm shooting 24 frames per second. Sometimes it might be 1/12th of the second shutter, so just to get a bit more light into the camera. And shot mostly with the Sony 24mm f1.4 lens or the 20mm f1.8 lens. They're very nice lenses for astro work and Northern Lights. So this isn't sped up, this is the way the Northern Lights actually move. And although sometimes the shots are a little bit on the darker side, what I really like about doing this is that what I'm showing you here is what you see with your own eyes when you go to Norway to see the Northern Lights. It's not sped up. This is the rate at which the Northern Lights can move when you have a very active display and a brighter display. And in terms of the brightness, it's actually very representative of what you actually see. It's perhaps a little bit brighter in the video than you see with your own lights, but when you get a nice aurora like this, where you have the pinks and the whites and yellows at the bottom of the aurora, it really does dance around like that. And it really is, once your eyes have adjusted to the light, moves quite quickly. I mean, you can see that I'm obviously, shooting in a very sensitive mode because we can clearly see all the stars in the nighttime sky as well. And it does require a very sensitive camera to video stars in real time. But what it shows you, I think, is that the FX3 really is that sort of one of the kings of low light. The FX3 and the FX6, if you've got very, very low light, very dark situations to shoot in, moonlit nights and things like that, they really, really are the king. So that's actually not the sun, that's the moon. And again, this is real time. No, actually, I think that's time-lapse, that one, looking at how quickly the aurora was moving. But the moon with the snow reflects off the snow, so you actually get a very bright environment. So that's the FX3 in terms of being super sensitive. Now, the other sort of restrictions and limitations really that I find that you get with these smaller cameras are things like the way that excuse me, output works. So right now, looking at the output of the camera, that's great. We can see what I'm shooting on an external monitor. It's kind of cropped in. If I come back to the main camera here, you'll see that my LCD screen is actually blank. There's nothing on here. So I have to rely on the external monitor when I'm outputting this way. I can have that up full frame. So if I turn off the info display again, that display will go now to full frame and fill the frame. And now what you find is that I have my menus are now on the LCD screen. And if I was using touch focus, so all of these cameras have touch focus, that I would be touching the LCD screen here on the back of the camera. Let me just turn the menus off for a second to do that. And in fact, because I'm outputting HD at the moment, I can have an output on here. So I'm outputting HD, and you can see I've got a live picture on the screen. But if I change my output to 4K, one of the things that happens, so I'm just going to change the output to 4K. Just in fact, actually now I have actually still got the output on here, but if I want the overlays on my monitor, then I can't have the overlays on here, and then that means I can't use touch to focus on here if I've got the overlays on the monitor, and there's various other limitations and things like that with these smaller cameras that are tricky. So when I go into record and things like that, I lose the output on this screen. So it does make the cameras a little harder to use at times, especially with an external monitor. So monitoring an external outputs is one of the limitations of these smaller cameras. You are much, much more limited as to what you can output to an external monitor while you're recording internally on the camera and things like that. And for a lot of sort of professional type applications, that can be quite restrictive. The FX6, on the other hand, you have both an SDI and an HDMI output. And that gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of what you're outputting. So if I bring the FX6 up right now, you'll see that I've got the overlays on my output. I've also, and this is pretty much exactly what I'm seeing in the viewfinder screen right now. So you're seeing what I'm seeing in the viewfinder. But one of the things that I can do is I can turn on and off the HDMI and SDI overlay. So I can turn off the HDMI overlay. So there's now a clean feed coming out of the camera. But in the viewfinder, I still have the overlays. And on the SDI, I can still have the overlays. So I might be perhaps feeding an SDI monitor, and I might be recording that. So we could output in UHD. And I could output in UHD or 4K on the SDI, and I might be recording that on an external device or going to an external vision mixer. And then I can output in HDMI, perhaps to a small monitor on the camera or another monitor on the camera, and I can have my overlays on that output while I'm also feeding a clean output. So your monitoring options and things like that are far, far more extensive with the FX6. And in professional applications, that is very important. It's very often that I will have a bigger monitor on the camera here. I might be feeding a video sender or a video transmitter, so I can send a live stream to the producer who might have a monitor with a wireless receiver, and that can be a clean feed, or it can be a feed with overlays depending on what the producer wants. And meanwhile, I can still have my overlays on the LCD if I want them or not. So I have a lot of flexibility with monitoring and things like that with this camera that I simply don't have with these cameras. And also having HDMI out with these cameras is a little bit more limited. HDMI connectors, they just pull out, they don't lock. You can get clamps and brackets that will hold this in to the camera, but also HDMI cables, they tend to be quite thick and chunky, and that makes them less flexible and things like that. Whereas if you're going only a short distance in HD in particular, you can use very skinny SDI cables, makes them more flexible and easy. And having two outputs means I can feed two different devices, one with HDMI, one with SDI. I've only got a single output here, so I only have one output choice. Now, one question that has actually come up in the questions is there any external monitor solution that will work with touch focus? And the answer is no, there isn't. There's no actual working solution currently that has just a monitor with touch to focus, because you'd have to have a touch screen, and B, you'd have to be able to feed that data back into the camera. Now, I am aware that Portkeys and some other manufacturers have monitors and they have some touchscreen functionality, but it doesn't actually allow you to do touch to focus currently with these cameras. It's a shame. It would be very nice, but that doesn't exist right now. So often when you're using an external monitor, when you hit record, your only overlays are going to be on the LCD on the camera. If you're outputting in 4K, you only have a blank screen that you have to touch on. It's doable, it's usable, but it's really not what you want. This is a much nicer way to work. A lot of people feel that this monitor, let's just take the hood off this for a second, is a little bit on the small size, and admittedly, it is quite a small monitor. It's not the biggest of screens. So what a lot of people actually do with the FX6 is they might have a bigger monitor here, perhaps a 5-inch or a 7-inch monitor here, connected to the SDI or HDMI, and then they place this viewfinder somewhere else, often at the back of the camera, or possibly even down here below the main monitor, so they can still use that for touch focus. And that is a popular way of working. And I really can't sort of emphasize enough actually how having the extra outputs on the FX6 for a lot of things is a bit of a game changer. There's other things. So if you are shooting log with these cameras, we do now have the Cine EI mode. So let me just bring the info overlays back on again. So we do now have the ability to shoot using Cine EI with these cameras. So I can put the camera into the Cine EI mode, and you've got different modes. So just quickly explaining the different modes that we have on the FX3 and 30. Obviously off, we're not shooting log. Then you have, I'm going to start from the bottom, Cine EI, which is where you have lookup tables and your exposure is based on lookup tables. And so if I come out of the menu now, you'll see that we have a lookup table applied, which is the Rec 709 lookup table. You can see that my exposure index is currently set very low. So if I go to 800, so this now is the exposure index that matches the base ISO. And you can see we're 800 EI, says at the bottom of the screen. 6.0E, that's my overexposure headroom. And then L tells me that I'm at the low base ISO, which is 800 ISO. And if I wind the exposure up, we stay at the low base ISO. If I go down, we stay at the low base ISO. So the low base ISO remains fixed, and then we change our exposure index. When we have a low exposure index, we have a very dark picture. That would make you open the aperture or remove ND generally, resulting in a brighter recording. When we have a very high exposure index, obviously the image becomes much brighter, and then that would generally make you stop down. So you'd perhaps close the aperture a little bit, and that would result in a darker recording, which will give you more overexposure headroom, but is going to end up pretty noisy. So that's your basic sort of Cine EI mode. Then we also have the Cine EI quick mode. And where this is different now, if I come out of this mode, out of the menu, you'll see that now, although that we're at 10,000 EI, that the base ISO has gone to H. There's an H at the end there, which is telling me that my ISO went up. So now, if you look at the low EIs, I've got an L at the end, which indicates that I'm at the low base ISO. As I bring up the exposure index, I'm still at the low exposure low base ISO. And when I get to 3,200, what's going to happen is the camera will automatically switch up to the high base ISO. You can see that's now gone to H. And you saw that the image actually, I'm not sure if you can see it, does get a little bit more noisy because we're in the high base ISO mode. And now I can go up to much, much higher ISOs. I can go up to or exposure indexes rather. I can go to 512,000 EI. So this generally switches you between the high and low base according to what the camera feels is the most appropriate. And generally I would agree that the place to switch is here. So as you go up to 3,200 EI, this is where you want to switch to the high base ISO. And it's just one less thing for you to have to change. So that's the Cine EI quick mode. And going back into the menu, the other mode is flexible ISO. So in flexible ISO, we're not using exposure index anymore. We are actually changing the ISO that the camera shoots at. So currently we're at 1600 ISO. So we'll have a little bit less dynamic range than we'd have at 800. We'll have a little bit more noise, and so on. And as you go higher and higher, you'll have less and less dynamic range. And in fact, one of the things that happens, if you look at the histogram, you can see that even though the pictures become very bright, actually, no, I'm talking rubbish, actually, that we're actually going to have a very noisy image because we're going up. Now, some people like to shoot this way, and that's absolutely fine. The bars above and below the ISO reading here mean we've got reduced recording range, because actually you have a reduced recording range. If I point the camera up at the light, if you look at where the light is clipping, you'll see it's a bit reduced. If I go up in ISO, can you see how that moves to the right? The clipping point on the right side of the histogram has reduced in level. So our recording range has actually reduced. As I go up, that clip point moves further and further to the right, and our recording range is extended again. So those bars actually mean you have a reduced recording range when you're below the base ISO. So this allows you to change the ISO while you're shooting log, but you're monitoring via a LUT. And you can see at the top of the screen, it says S709. So that's the LUT that we're using. So the Cine EI, or the flexible ISO mode, is not exposure index. This is changing the gain of the camera as you change the ISO. It is a useful mode, but just do be aware of the limitations of it if you shoot it compared to exposure index. There are pros and cons to both. My preferred method generally is to use exposure index because I can control my dynamic range. I can control my highlight overexposure range and underexposure range. But one of the limitations of these cameras, of the FX, excuse me, 3 and FX30 in that mode, is when it comes to monitoring, is you can only choose one option, which is LUT on or LUT off. If the LUT is off, then Cine EI doesn't really do anything for you, doesn't provide any assistance because Cine EI relies on the LUT. The fact that we either have LUT on globally or LUT off globally means that there is no way with these cameras to easily monitor the S-log3, to measure the S-log3 exposure while perhaps looking at the LUT, because it's either LUT on globally or LUT off globally. You don't have a monitoring option that allows you to have a LUT and also perhaps see and measure the S-log3. And that's again an area where the FX6 is a bit better, because we can, if I bring the FX6 menus up, choose where our LUTs are. So I don't think this is in Cine EI at the moment. So let me, just going to quickly go to my project settings. Find it easier to change this here. So I'm going to Cine EI mode. And now I'm in Cine EI mode. Come out of the menu, go back into the quick menu here. I have various options with my LUTs. So I could, for example, have the LUT on for the viewfinder, so I can see in the viewfinder the LUTed image. Oops. And then perhaps have the LUT off for my outputs. And when set like this, so in the viewfinder I have the LUT, but my waveform display, you can see indicates above it, is measuring the log. So that does give me a bit more flexibility with my measuring of the log, monitoring with a LUT. There are still some limitations, but it does give you a little bit more flexibility to do different things and monitor different ways. It's when you go to the Venice camera, you can have multiple LUTs. You can actually have a different LUT in the viewfinder to what's on the SDI out, and there's also a monitor out, and that could be S-Log3. So you have lots and lots of different options in the Venice camera, and that's part of what you're paying for when you pay for that much, much more expensive camera. So lots of subtle differences between all of these cameras, but a big one is monitoring, and that's something to be really aware of. Now, one of the things I do really like about all of these cameras, and I'm using right now actually, so I'm shooting this, the camera that is filming me is another FX6, and the audio, the microphone on that camera is a Sony MI shoe mounted radio wireless microphone. So it's similar to this one. And one of the nice things about all of these cameras is they have an MI shoe. So the FX6 has an MI shoe on the handle here. So I can put that radio mic onto the handle. It powers the receiver if you're using the Sony UWP D system. It powers the receiver, so I don't have to worry about batteries for the radio mic receiver. And the audio goes directly in via the MI shoe. And that then means that my XLR inputs are now available on the FX6 for 2 more audio channels. Or I can use the built-in mic on the handle as well. So I can have 4 audio channels, 2 from the wireless and 2 via XLR, or 2 from the internal mics. And that gives me a lot of flexibility on the audio front. Now, with the smaller cameras, we have some differences. Now, I should have brought it with me. I haven't got it now. What comes with the FX3 and is an option for the FX30 is a handle that goes onto the camera. Maybe I've got a picture of it in my slides. Just bear with me a second, so you know what I'm talking about. So you get this handle that goes on the top of the camera, and that gives you 2 XLR inputs, and there's also a 3.5mm jack input. Now, if you want to use MI shoe with the FX3 and the FX30, you can't use that handle, because the handle connects to the cameras with the MI shoe. So if you do want to use this wireless mic receiver and power it from the camera and feed directly into the camera, it has to go on the MI shoe on the camera like that. And that limits your audio input options. There is a 3.5mm jack on the side of the camera, but the audio preamps with that are not so good. It does still, if you've got the dual channel receiver, give me 2 audio inputs. So I could use 2 wireless radio mics with this, and that works very well. My other option would be to have the handle on the camera and to use this same microphone, but instead of powering it and utilizing the MI shoe, connect to the audio outputs on this via XLRs into the ones on the handle. And then I can use the 3.5mm jack on the handle to get another couple of channels of audio in. But generally, I don't find the audio routing and configuration on these cameras as convenient. Now, it doesn't mean you can't get great audio, because you can. It's just not quite as flexible as you have with the FX6. And I think this is partly what you're paying for with this larger camera, is you have greater flexibility in the way you can do things like audio and monitoring, powering, and all of those things. And that makes a big difference for me. I've got another question that's come up. I'll come to that question in a minute. I won't ignore it, but we'll carry on with audio for the moment and the sort of differences between the cameras. If you take the handle off the FX6, which does remove, unfortunately, you lose the XLR inputs, which for me is a strange, let's call it a feature of the FX6 that I really wish wasn't there. There is a scratch mic on the side of the camera, so it still records audio if you're using it on a gimbal and things like that. But if you take the handle off, you do have to do your audio externally somehow. But with the top handle on, with the MI shoe on the handle, this is a way I shoot. I'm not going to say all of the time, but certainly a large amount of the time is with a radio mic receiver on the hand grip here, feeding audio directly into the camera. I might have one channel of wireless. I might have one channel from a external mic on here. Then I might have the camera mic as a backup going to 3 and 4. So I have great audio flexibility. When I come down to these cameras, I lose a large amount of that flexibility. The FX9 has 4 rotary dials for audio control. The FX6 just has 2. And these cameras with the handle on, they have 2 dials on the handle for your primary audio control, and a 3rd dial for secondary audio control, which is great, but you still just don't quite have that flexibility and that versatility when it comes to audio configuration between the larger cameras and the smaller cameras. In terms of external power, what differences do we have there? Well, I mentioned earlier that the FX6 is a 19-volt camera, and there is a power in jack down here. It's basically the same as a laptop power supply, readily and very cheaply available if you want to buy one, an external one, or you can get V-mount adapters from various third parties that will give you that 19-volt out. They convert from the 14 volts of V-mount to the 19 volts. And a V-mount battery will run this camera, a 100-watt-hour camera will run it for about 3 hours, 150-watt-hour battery will run it for 4 or 5 hours. And we've got a very big cooling fan in the camera, so you don't have to worry about overheating or anything like that. And this camera will just run for ages on external power. When we come down to the smaller cameras, it gets a little bit more complicated. So the internal battery on the camera, pop one out, is one of these. It's a much smaller battery if you compare the size of that with that. And obviously this doesn't last as long. I get on average around about an hour out of one of these, depending on codecs and a few other things, whereas one of these runs this for ages. So very often when I'm using these cameras, I've either got one of these in my pocket ready to go, or if I'm on a tripod, I'm looking at external powering options. So what are those options? There's a few. So one is actually, you can get a dummy battery that goes in here. And if that dummy battery has a regulator, this is super, super, super important. If your dummy battery has a regulator, it can take perhaps from a D-tap from a V-mount battery into here directly, powers the camera off the dummy battery. But it's super important that that system has a regulator in it to go from the 14 volts of a V-mount battery down to the 7.4 volts that goes in here. So super, super important you have a regulator. Your other option, and it's one I use actually for when I'm doing the Northern Lights and shooting all night long, is the camera supports power via USB-C PD. So I'll use a USB-C PD power bank with a USB-C cable going into here to power the camera. Now you must still have a battery in the camera. And generally what I like to do is have a fully charged battery in the camera and then run the camera off a USB-C PD power bank. And then the camera will run for as long as that power bank lasts. But it must be USB-C PD, not just regular USB-C. And that a larger power bank will run these cameras for many, many hours. The bigger ones will generally run the camera for 5 or 6 hours. These cameras do have cooling fans, so they will run continuously, so you can shoot conferences and events and things like that with them, provided the camera is set to the high temperature mode. In the menu, there's a setting for allowing the camera to run in a slightly higher temperature mode, and when the camera is set that way, it will just run continuously, and the fan will help keep it cool, unlike a lot of other DSLR or mirrorless type cameras. But generally, I don't find powering this externally quite as, I think the word I'm looking for is robust, because a USB-C PD connector sticking out of here, they're not the strongest of connectors. Then you've got to find some way to mount your power bank. Generally, I'll hang that in a pouch under the tripod. There are things, so like Core do a really nice battery. I can't think what they call it now. That battery actually sits underneath the camera. It's a V-mount battery, but it also has a USB-C PD power output that you can power the camera with. And more V-mount batteries are now appearing with USB-C PD outputs that you can use to power the camera. But with these, it becomes, where do you put that battery? Because if you put it right behind the camera here, a lot of these controls get difficult to get at. Then you have to sort of perhaps flip out the LCD screen and have it sideways on here with your battery back here. And generally speaking, rigging this up becomes a little bit more complicated. What I do really like about these cameras, though, is that when you use them like this is actually often all you need for run and gun shooting. Maybe if I do have the radio mic just going directly into the MI shoe of the camera on the top here, I can run around with this. It's a very small, very convenient, very compact package. I do still get about an hour out of it, and swapping the battery doesn't take very long. So this is really good. I mean, this is really good shooting behind the scenes at the theatre and circus at Glastonbury, for example. I almost felt I was cheating because it's so small and it's so light. I mean, I've been in this business now for 30 years. And when I started, cameras were huge, like immense things that sat on your shoulder with a heavy lens and extremely heavy battery, and the battery didn't last long. And then in the very early days, a great big portable recorder. And that felt like you were working. And even more recently, with a typical 3-chip ENG camera, like a PDW 700, that's an old camera now, PMW 500, whatever, it's still quite a bit of weight on your shoulder, Z750. And it's hard work. Being able to just grab this, you've got in-body camera stabilization, perhaps a stabilized lens as well, like this 18 to 105 is, suddenly it doesn't feel like you're working anymore and you kind of feel like you're cheating. But you can get beautiful, beautiful images easily. And for me, this is where these cameras, these small cameras, the FX30, the FX3 really excel, is using them like this, as they were designed really to be used as handheld run and gun little cameras. Then when I'm doing interviews and things like that, or I do need that external ND, perhaps shooting outdoors, I go up to the FX6, maybe the FX9, if I need some of those news functions. And then for digital cinema, we move up to the Venice cameras and things like this. Now, some people have been a little bit perhaps critical of Sony with the Cinema Line, and they sort of say, well, hang on a minute, the FX3, FX30 menu is different to the FX6, FX9 menu, which is different to the Venice menu. And it's true. That's a fair comment, that they do have different menu systems, and it perhaps would be nice if they were a bit more unified in that regard. So why do they call this a Cinema Line? Well, the big thing is that, broadly speaking, the image quality matches across all of these cameras. So if you shoot with a Venice and you use the default S709 LUT, and you shoot with an FX3 or an FX30 and you use the same default S709 LUT, it's actually quite surprising how similar the images are. Now, I'm not saying that this is as good as a Venice. It's not. There are differences. There are some differences in the way the Venice camera handles those real extremes of exposure, the extreme highlights, extreme shadows, and the linearity of the color and things like that, that do make the Venice images that little bit nicer. And of course, we have the 8K sensor in the Venice. But when we come down to these cameras, the pictures, the color science is almost exactly the same. And what that means is it's very easy to mix and match between these cameras. So if I, let's see if we can do this very quickly. I'm going to use the FX30. Bring up a couple of these cameras quickly. So my FX3 is there. And so this is the FX6. And then this is the FX3. Let's try and get a similar exposure. What lens have I got on here? That's f4. It's as fast as I can go with this lens. So I'm in the flexible flexible mode. So if I bring that up to a similar exposure to the FX3, and then let me change my white balance to match the FX6. If we quickly toggle between these cameras, actually, there are some differences. So what's the FX6 set to? 5,500. I'm looking at a mirrored image, which makes all of this look a little bit difficult. And we're on the S709 LUT on both. I'm quite surprised actually at the differences there. I think it's because I'm in the flexible ISO mode in the FX3 and not the Cine EI mode. And we do have a greatly different lens, but generally speaking, they're not immensely. Of course, we're looking at S-Log. Duh. Let me look at the LUT. Right, so that's the FX6, that's the FX3, and as you can see, the images are similar. They're not exactly the same. If I was to perhaps white balance a bit more carefully, so let me change my white balance settings on here. This is really difficult looking at this mirror image. In fact, I can do it this way. I'm not going to waste a huge amount of time on that. But if I was to take a white balance off the wall with both cameras, they would be much, much closer, and you'd have no problem with two different camera angles mixing and matching between these two cameras. It would be a really simple thing to do. I'm finding it's quite difficult. I'm looking at a very let's try and do this. Okay. So that's the FX3. And the FX6, let's do a white balance with this one as well. Preset. So FX6, FX3, not very scientific, but two different camera angles. These would cut together reasonably acceptably. I'm confident in that. Let me turn the overlays off. So FX3. And FX6. Yeah, I still need to fiddle around with that white balance a little bit. But essentially the white balance of the two cameras, if you do it properly and white balance off a white card, you will have pictures that match across all of the cinema line. And in fact, right now, there is a major feature film that I've been a little bit involved with that's shooting currently, and they're using FX3 alongside the Venice camera because they can get shots that they wouldn't be able to get with the bulk of a Venice, even with the Venice Rialto system on it, and they can get those shots with the FX3, and they know that certainly after both have been graded, they'll look so close that the audience probably won't be aware that there's a difference, that the different camera has been used for the different shots. And this really is the core of the idea behind the Cinema Line, is by having the same color science, the same LUTs, the same S-log3 curve, etc., across all of these cameras, that in post-production, you can make them all look the same. In fact, straight out of the box, they look very, very similar. There are some very subtle differences between them. They're not identical, but they are different cameras. They do have different sensors, but they're close enough that, especially if you have two different camera angles, two different shots, that your audience isn't going to realize that you're using greatly different cameras. If you consider that the FX3 here is around about £2,000 and the FX6 is £6,000-ish, the fact that two cameras, even with such a big price difference, looks so very, very similar that's the key. That's the whole point, really, of what the Cinema Line is about. And of course, Sony painted them all grey because that kind of looks cool anyway, that they all match and looks a little different to a black DSLR. So we've got a few questions coming in, and yeah, the FX3 white balance, and the reason these two cameras currently look a little bit wrong is their white balances don't match. Maybe at the end of the session I'll come back to that and I'll spend a bit more time and do it properly, but it's a little bit difficult without tripods and everything else and trying to manage a live stream to do it all at the same time. One of the questions that's come up is to explain the difference between S709 and the 709-800 LUT. So if I bring the FX6 up here, so the FX6 currently is in the log shooting mode, in the Cine EI mode, and what you're seeing here is the S709 LUT. Now, the S709 LUT was originally designed for the Sony Venice camera, and it's designed to give a quite a film-like look. And one of the things with S709 is that white wants to be at around about 70, I've got to get this right, because I get S709 and S709 and S-Cinetone muddled up. So the S709 LUT was designed for a more film-like look. The 709-800 LUT is designed for a standard Rec 709 look. So if I switch between those two LUTs now, if I go here and I go down and change my base look to 709-800, if you look at the waveform, you can see that the levels are actually now much higher. If you look on the right-hand side of the waveform, you'll see that the white of the wall is at around 90%, or it's actually pretty close to 100%. Let me just bring it down to where it perhaps should be, which would be about there. The white of the wall would be about 90%. And the sort of the crossover on the chart is around about 60%, is around about 45%, which is where middle grey would normally be with Rec 709. And we have a very contrasty image. And I know that if I was shooting people, this wouldn't really look film-like in any way, shape or form. It would just look like ordinary Rec 709. And that's okay. And in fact, I'd still use this LUT when I'm shooting sometimes, when I want to be very accurate with my exposure or want to have a bit more contrast to make focusing easier. It's quite a contrasty LUT. But this is ordinary Rec 709. And the 800 bit means that it has a highlight roll-off that gives you 800% dynamic range. So that's roughly 4 times more dynamic range than ordinary 709, but that's all in the highlight roll-off above 90%. So let me go now back to the S709 LUT. And what you're going to see is the levels become much lower, you'll see now that that white is around about 83%, something like that. And that's where it wants to be, because this is now designed to give you a much more film-like look. So skin tones will be a bit darker, the mid-range is all a little bit darker, and more of the highlights are contained in the viewable range. So if my white is now at around about 80%, 83%, then I've got more of my highlights in that upper range. So S709 is designed to give you a more film-like look compared to Rec 709. It is a little bit flatter though. It's less contrasty, so focusing is a little harder with it if you're monitoring via the LUT. And you just need to be aware of those exposure differences. So the short answer is that S709 was designed to be more film-like compared to 709-800, which is just a vanilla Rec 709 LUT. In post-production, I almost never use either of these two LUTs. I tend to use other LUTs or grade from scratch, or these days use a color managed workflow, such as either DaVinci Resolve's own color managed workflow or ACE's. As LUTs I find are restricting. When you have a certain LUT, you tend to shoot in a certain way for a certain end result. And perhaps that is what you want to do for the way you shoot. But I prefer to just perhaps use a Rec 709 LUT just for exposure and then do all my grading in post-production, because I like different productions to look different ways. As an example, if you look, when you watch my videos, the grade for the stuff that I did in the Circus Big Top, which was shot with the the prime lens on the FX30, is very different to the grade that I used on the Norway footage, where I wanted a different look. I don't want every production to look the same. I want them to look different, and often that means a completely different grade. And I feel personally that LUTs tend to push you into a certain corner with your look. Whereas if you don't use LUTs and you grade from scratch or use a color managed workflow, you tend to go down different routes for different productions and end up with different looks, which is something I really like. Okay, so I've got a few questions. So when I import FX6 footage recorded in S-Log3 Cine into FCPX, the LUT applied makes the waveform look slightly hot on exposure. Is this FCPX reading the footage incorrectly as full or legal range? No, it isn't. If your exposure looks hot, then it probably was hot. Now, one of the things that currently doesn't happen in FCPX or Adobe Premiere is the reading of metadata, the way the whole S-Log3 and Cine EI system was designed to work. And this has been a frustration actually from day one with Cine EI and the Sony cameras. So when you use a high or a low exposure index, that exposure index metadata is recorded. And when you take the footage into Catalyst Browse, it will compensate for that. So I wasn't planning on doing this. So I'm going to wing this a little bit. So let's see if this works. Hopefully it will. It could all go horribly wrong. Where's Catalyst Browse on my laptop? So let's have a look at Catalyst Browse on my laptop. And let's see if I've got some footage on the laptop. I should have. No, okay, so let me drill down here and I'll find my sample footage that I do normally keep on the computer. Right, so in here I should have some FX6 samples. And if I open up, actually I think these are all shot at the base exposure index, so I'm not sure these are going to help. If I go to the color room here, yeah, these were shot at the base EI. Have I got anything that wasn't shot at the base EI? What was this shot at? There we go. So this clip here, we can see in the metadata here, was shot at the base of 12,800, but the exposure index was 3,200. And we have a -2 stop correction. So what's happening here is that Catalyst Browse is automatically correcting for the exposure index that I shot at. If I go to off and I bring that metadata slider up to 12,000, color temperature. Yeah, so in fact, in off, you see the brightness goes up. When I use the metadata, the brightness comes down. So when I'm off, there is no exposure index correction occurring in post-production, and the girl's face here looks overexposed because I did use a low EI to deliberately expose a bit brighter. When we use the metadata, Catalyst Browse automatically corrects for the exposure index that you shot at. So this is how it would have looked in the viewfinder when you shot, and this is how I'm expecting and want it to look. So now her face looks exposed as I intended. So this is actually how Cine EI is supposed to work. But for forever, most of the post-production applications ignore the metadata, because it's only recently that they've actually started including the LUTs in their output. Now, if I go now to DaVinci Resolve, and let's just open up DaVinci Resolve. So in the beta versions, 18.5 and on beta versions of DaVinci Resolve now, and I'm not sure if it's in the full versions, we have a very similar thing. So I'm going to open up a new project here. I'm pretty sure this is beta 5 that I'm on. Maybe this isn't the beta that I've got in here right now, but let's see. So I'm going to find that same FX6 footage. Now, at the moment, this only works with MXF files. It doesn't work with the MP4 files from the FX30, etc. So let me just drop that clip into my timeline here. And I'm going to go to a color managed workflow. So in my settings, I'm going to go to color managed, and we're going to output in Rec 709. And now my footage looks pretty much the same as it did in Catalyst Browse, and I've done nothing else. Now, if I go to the color grading room here in Resolve, and I go to the raw controls here, at the moment, this says project, but if I change this to camera metadata, well, I won't see a change because my default for my project is camera metadata, but if I go to clip, I can now access that metadata, and you can see that the exposure index or the exposure has been set for this clip to 3200. So again, now in the newest versions, the beta versions of DaVinci Resolve, it's applying that exposure index correction as it should be done, and it's also applying, or it's converting, in this is color managed workflow, to 709. Now, if I change my exposure back up to 12,800, around there, you'll see again that her face looks overexposed because this is exposed more brightly. But by using the camera metadata, the exposure correction is now being applied correctly and appropriately to the footage. So everything that you do now in your Cine EI mode is transferring all the way through your workflow. Now, hopefully, Adobe will catch up with this, and hopefully FCP will as well, because Premiere and FCP do not apply that correction. So if you've used a low EI, your footage will come in looking at overexposed. This needs to happen, and I hope it will. And especially now that the cameras are now getting the ability to what's called embed the LUT. So if I bring up the FX3, and let's bring on the overlays for a second. So the FX3, the FX30, and the FX9 currently do this. The FX6 is going to get this function when the new firmware is released, which is imminent. if I go to, I'm trying to think where it is. Where is it in the settings? My brain isn't working. Here we go, embedded LUT. We now have this option, whether we're shooting flexible ISO or any of the log modes, to embed the LUT. And what this does is it records the LUT that you've used. So if you're not using S709 or using a third-party LUT, or if you're using S709, the LUT is now recorded onto the SD card, so that that same LUT can then be picked up by your grading software. The exposure index can be applied and everything looks as you shot it. Now, as I say, currently in Resolve, this only works with MXF files, so it doesn't actually work with the MP4 files from the FX3 and FX30, which is a very great shame. But this is all coming. It's all trickling down through workflows and everything else. And it's really going to make using these cameras very much like working with a RAW camera. And actually, there is much less of a difference between shooting S-Log and RAW than people think there is. You know, especially now these workflows and the ability to change the exposure and everything else is much easier. So, I mean, you know, just taking, let's just use a different clip to that one. Let's just use one of these clips here. So if I take this clip now, if I go into my color tools and I go to those same camera raw settings and I go to clip, I can adjust my exposure. I can make it brighter or darker as I wish, just by using the exposure slider. I can change my white balance. I can change it as required, just as you would with a raw workflow. And it really isn't actually all that different to a raw workflow. So it is going to make making these changes and getting this flexibility much, much better. And I really would urge those of you that do like to grade your footage to use proper grading software. So FCP was never designed for grading. It's an editing platform, and I'm not a fan personally, but it is a very good editing platform. You know, if you like the way FCP works, it's really good for very fast editing, but it's not grading software. I really would urge you to use proper grading software, and ultimately that comes down to DaVinci Resolve. I have no affiliation with Blackmagic Design other than really, really liking their product, the DaVinci Resolve product as a grading application, because once upon a time that was £40,000, and now there's a free version, or if you want all the tools and you want to be able to do all of this stuff, the paid version is a one-off payment of, I think it's $299 now, and it just gets better and better and better, both as an editing package and as a grading package. So what are, looking at some of the other questions, regarding audio on the FX6, is there a solution for audio in when you remove the top handle? No, there isn't. There, unfortunately, there is a lot of digital processing that goes on in this handle. So the signal comes in as an analog signal, it's converted to digital, and then it's a digital signal that's passed to the camera, and there's handshaking between the camera and the handle. And basically the camera says, "Hello handle, are you there?" So it's not easy to get audio in on that connector. There's quite a few people that have worked at getting broken handles and things like that, stripping the electronics out and making it work that way. And you can do that, but you've got to find a scrap handle to do that. But to date, even though this camera is now, close to 3 years old, nobody's come up with a third-party solution to do that because it's difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And I think it is a great shame, and I think it is an oversight by Sony. And I think they probably quietly might admit that, although they'll never publicly say that. There's various rumors as to why it's ended up that way, and one was on the FS5, which is a very similar looking camera. There was a separate XLR on the body, and when they surveyed users, the user said, "We don't like having an XLR on the body, we want both XLRs up here." Go figure, I don't know. I don't know why they didn't just put a 3.5mm jack on the body. eventually, when an FX6 replacement comes along, I'm sure they'll address it then. I don't think they'll do the same thing twice. But until that time, that is unfortunately the way it is. My solution is, rather than using an external audio recorder, is to take the HDMI out to an external video recorder, record my video on that, so that'll perhaps be something like an Atomos Shogun, Atomos Ninja, and then feed your microphones into that so that the audio and video are together within the same files. I don't like having external audio, or the audio separate to the video. I know it's very easy to sync it up in post now with pluralize and various things like that. And you can get a timecode cable to go into the camera. So syncing isn't a major drama. I just don't like having the files separate because there is a risk that one could become lost. But if you use an external video recorder, feed your audio into that as well, everything's kept together and you don't have to worry about syncing stuff up later on in post. But it does kind of defeat the whole idea of having a compact camera that can record sound and pictures together. It's frustrating, I know, and it's a shame. So what else have we got? So is APR the same as black balance? No, it's not. So one of the things that these cameras will do when you turn them on periodically, it's about once a week, is asked to do something called an APR. And in fact, let me just have a look at this, because I think my FX3 might ask me to do it, because it wasn't, hasn't been used for a little bit. So if I turn the FX3 on now, give it a moment to connect. No, it's not going to do it. Maybe it was the FX3. Let's have a look at the FX3 and see if it was that one. Interesting. It's not asking for it now. That's the FX3. Because the FX3 APR, it does it automatically and without any user interaction. Because the FX3, one of the things that has to be done with APR is you have to exclude all light from the sensor. Maybe it was my FX6 that was doing. I know one of these cameras asked for it this morning. So periodically, when you turn on the FX9, yeah, it was the FX6 that was asking for it. You'll get this message: the FX9, the FX6, and the FX30 will all give you this message that says, please execute APR. Now, I don't have a lens cap to hand, but what you have to do is you put the lens cap on the camera and then you execute the APR function. I would highly recommend that you execute APR after flying, and you can do it manually in all of these cameras. In the FX6, it's down in the maintenance section. Oh no, not maintenance, it's in technical. Oops. It's down here somewhere. There we go. And you can do it manually. And I recommend that you do it after you fly anywhere with the camera. So what APR does, and where it's different from black balance, is that APR scans the sensor for pixels that are out of specifications, either too bright or perhaps too dark. So something that happens is there's cosmic rays that come from outer space. They pass through the atmosphere. They can hit the sensor and they can damage the pixels in a video sensor. So every now and again, you need to check the sensor, check that there aren't any pixels that are out of spec, which might show up as a white dot on your picture. And then the APR function will map that sensor out, and so you no longer see a problem, and that white dot will never ever be seen again. The camera will periodically ask for it because there are millions and millions and millions of pixels on a sensor, so the likelihood of one getting damaged are, well, if it's 1 in a million, if you've got several million, then the odds are higher that you'll have actually a damaged pixel somewhere. So it's about once a week, the camera's going to ask you to do it, and you should always do it. Don't ignore it. It doesn't take long. It only takes a few seconds. The FX30 will also ask you to perform an APR because the FX30 doesn't have an internal shutter. So the only way you can guarantee excluding all light from the sensor is by putting a lens cap on the lens. The same with the FX6 and the FX9. The FX30 doesn't ask to do an APR because it has an internal shutter. So the FX30 will do an APR from time to time when you turn the camera off. And that's why sometimes when you turn the FX30 off, sorry, FX3 off, you'll hear the shutter actuate, and maybe 10 or 15 seconds later, you'll hear the camera shut down. And that's the camera doing APR in the background without your intervention. You can also do it manually. You can go into the menu and you can do it by the menu. So, and if you fly with a camera, you're much higher up in the atmosphere, especially if you go anywhere near the North or South Pole on a polar route. And many flights these days take polar routes. If you fly from Europe to various parts of Asia, or if you fly to the US, you'll go much further north towards the poles. The Earth's magnetic field concentrates some of those damaging particles, so the likelihood of having a hot pixel or an out-of-spec pixel is much greater after a flight. So you do a flight, especially a long-haul flight, always do an APR on your camera when you land, and it's basically remedying those pixels. Now, black balance is something slightly different, and it tends to be less of an issue these days than it was before, and that's setting the gain of the red, green, and blue channels of the camera to be even at black. So just as you have white balance, where you want, with a white target, your gain to be equal, so white looks white, black balance sets the gain in the blacks, the red, green, and blue gain, to be equal so that your blacks look black and don't have a tint. Now, generally these days, cameras are so stable electronically that you don't need to do a black balance manually. Previous generations of cameras that had analog circuits, those analog circuits tended to drift. So black balance was something you needed to do regularly. Also, sometimes using different gain levels with certain other manufacturers' cameras can cause shifts in black balance. But with the Sony cameras nowadays, the black level and black balance is so stable, it's rarely necessary to do it. Now, I do believe that black balance is done during the APR process, as part of the APR process, but that is something that's done as part of APR. But actually the black balance function, where the camera has a black balance function, is different to the APR function of the camera. APR is something you really should do regularly. If you're doing a big budget production, something really important, I would probably recommend that you do it every day. You should certainly do it weekly. And you should certainly do it when the camera requests to do it. It doesn't take long to do. What other questions do we have? Have I answered all of them? I think I have. I have an FX6 and mainly shoot documentary and some broadcast news. I've always used S-Cinetone for everything. What do you think of this, and am I wrong? Well, filmmaking, cinematography, there are really nothing is black and white. Nothing is necessarily right or wrong. I love shooting with S-Log3, and I shoot most things with S-Log3. Does that mean shooting with S-Cinetone is wrong? Absolutely not. No, it doesn't. If it works for you and gets you the result that you want, then it's right. S-Cinetone, I think, is really very, very good. Compared to shooting with old Rec 709, which had a television look of days gone by, perhaps, was fine in the day. But now we have these cameras with much bigger dynamic range. Rec 709, normal Rec 709 is quite restricting. It's very limited with dynamic range, and you tend to have very crushed highlights. So you get problems with overexposed areas and things like that. So S-Cinetone, the idea behind S-Cinetone is to get away from a lot of those issues. So it has a very gentle, very smooth highlight roll-off, and that extends your dynamic range a bit. You don't have the full dynamic range that you'd have if you shot with S-Log3. But I think what you have to consider is that if you shoot with log and you do your grade, it's very rare for you to actually include every last bit of that dynamic range in your graded end result, because the picture would actually look quite flat. So generally, you're not always using the extreme shadows or the extreme highlights after you've graded, because those extremes don't necessarily always look nice. So what S-Cinetone tries to do is to take a really large dynamic range and make it work well on a normal Rec 709 TV. So the majority of TVs today are still Rec 709 capable, and most broadcasting, etc., is Rec 709. So S-Cinetone gives you that much more contemporary film-like look that's desirable today, that wasn't, where Rec 709 isn't necessarily regarded as pretty anymore. It gives you that contemporary film-like look. You have slightly lower skin tones. So generally, if I'm shooting with S-Cinetone, excuse me, you'll shoot with your faces and skin tones exposed somewhere around 60% instead of 70%. So you have those slightly lower skin tone levels that with contemporary video tends to be more popular. You have a really nice shadow roll off, so it looks fairly film-like, and generally it's a very nice looking image. And you don't need to do any grading. And it looks really great straight out of the camera. And there's nothing wrong with that. There is nothing that says you must shoot log and you must grade your footage. Shooting with S-Cinetone is a quick, simple, and easy way to get a really nice looking picture straight out of the camera. So if it works for you, if it gets you the result that you want, then I say go for it. This camera here is set to S-Cinetone right now. I use S-Cinetone when I want very fast turnaround. If I'm handing footage off to a client and I don't trust their grading abilities, I use S-Cinetone and it looks great. I don't think I've ever had a client complain that S-Cinetone didn't look nice. In fact, I know I haven't ever had a client say it didn't look nice. You can hand over S-Log3 material and somebody might make a complete hash of grading it, and it could end up looking horrible if they don't know what they're doing. So there's a lot of really good things to be said about S-Cinetone, and it's one of the really nice things that is now in all of these cameras. So carry on. If it's doing good for you, then absolutely carry on. Nothing wrong with it at all. So another question. In Resolve, how do you manage the ProRes RAW non-compatibility issue since the FX6 outputs RAW to a Ninja 5 that uses a ProRes RAW codec? Well, the answer actually is very simple. I don't shoot ProRes RAW. I've tested this a lot. Now, when you had a camera like the FS5, which only had 8-bit recording in 4K, being able to output RAW and record that RAW on an external recorder, in the case of the FS5 RAW, it was 12-bit linear, really did give you a significant image quality advantage. Now we have these cameras that shoot with a fairly decent internal 10-bit codec, 422 with S-Log3. The difference between shooting with that ProRes RAW and shooting with the internal S-Log3 is tiny. Now, you're not going to get more dynamic range out of the RAW. You're not going to have some magic ability to shoot immensely overexposed and then it all be fantastic in post-production. RAW does not work that way. RAW, when you shoot RAW, captures one white balance, which is the white balance that the camera sensor was set to at the time you captured, and it captures the same dynamic range as if you shoot log. It doesn't capture more. The only thing that you do get is a greater bit depth. And that can, with a really perfect workflow, give you some advantages. But because we can't get that into a decent grading package easily, although there are tools now that are coming out that allow you to do that. So Assimilate have a tool for converting ProRes RAW to Cinema DNG. The benefits just aren't there, because a workflow, and your whole workflow is something that starts with the camera and finishes with your delivery format. And really every step all the way through that workflow wants to be optimized. You want the optimum recording format with the optimum post-production grading and the optimum delivery. If you take ProRes RAW and you go into FCPX, it really isn't a great grading package, so you don't have optimum grading. And that really, for me, defeats the whole purpose, the whole point of it. If I want to get something a bit better than the internal recordings, I'll take that output to an external recorder and I'll record ordinary 10-bit 422 ProRes. And that is a little bit less compressed, so you'll have a slight reduction in compression artifacts. But even then, most of the time, I don't believe that your final audience will actually be able to see the difference. Now, we tested this for this feature film that I've been involved in, and we compared internal XAVC recording to external ProRes, recording to ProRes RAW, and then transcoding so we could get it into post-production. And we compared all of them. And actually, from the end result, it was extremely hard to find any difference whatsoever. And in the end, it was determined that the order of preference would be output to an external recorder and record ProRes, record internally with XAVC, and the last one, the one that was least preferred, was the ProRes RAW workflow, because by the time you've transcoded, and of course when you transcode you're going to have to convert from RAW to S-Log3. At that time the Cinema DNG workflow with Assimilate wasn't available. All of those extra steps negate the benefit that the RAW brings, which is a tiny, tiny benefit of a slightly greater bit depth. And I know now, especially now we have these RAW controls in Resolve that work with the S-Log3, where I can change my white balance and do all of those things that you expect to be able to do with a RAW workflow, that really I don't see the benefit of having an external recorder using ProRes RAW and then being restricted to either a workflow that requires transcoding, conversion, and all of that other stuff just to get it into Resolve, or uses a less good grading software, grading package. The whole point of shooting RAW is to maximize your grading options. So you want to use proper grading software. Maybe other people will disagree with me on this. It's not really totally black and white, but my testing has suggested to me that ProRes RAW with these cameras via FCP is not going to give me a result that is obviously better to my audience than just shooting the internal XAVC codec, even if you screw up the exposure. S-Log3 is very forgiving. And ultimately, in a lot of these workflows, your limiting factor will be noise rather than anything else. Now, a more highly compressed codec may have a little bit more compression noise than going into ProRes RAW, but then I always find the ProRes RAW recordings to be pretty noisy. And often that noise is what limits how far you can grade and how far you can push your footage. And if you've shot something and you're a bit underexposed, well, the noise isn't going to come from the codec. The noise is going to come from the fact that you're underexposed. And whether you're in ProRes RAW or whether you're in XAVC, it's going to limit how much you can grade your footage, not whether you're RAW or XAVC. If you've overexposed and your highlights are clipped, well, they'll be clipped in the RAW and they'll be clipped in the XAVC. So you're not going to be able to get more out of one than the other. The limit will be the way you shot. So really, in a proper workflow, you expose properly. You take great care over your exposure. That's your starting point, because well exposed footage is so much easier to work with than badly exposed footage. Record it with a suitably good codec. And I think one of the things that we do need to consider, and it gets lost in all of this, is that the A to D converters in these cameras are only 12-bit. So the A to D converters in the cameras is a limiting factor anyway in what comes out of these cameras. So record with a decent codec. The XAVC codec, yes, it's not perfect. If you study it deeply and hard enough, you can, in certain circumstances, if you go pixel peeping, find artifacts. It's not compression artifact free, but in real world applications, those artifacts, I've never ever seen XAVC artifacts show up in such a way that in real world footage they've been an issue, unless the footage is immensely underexposed or really badly exposed. But then the problem isn't the codec, the problem is the exposure. So in all of these things, expose really, really well. If you do want something a little bit better, perhaps record ProRes. But if I've done tests, they're on my website where I've compared the ProRes and the XAVC recordings, and I'd challenge most people to find those differences. And when you're getting to something where you have to challenge somebody to find the difference, your audience isn't going to see that difference. They just won't. So is it worth the effort and everything else? Most of the time, I don't believe it is. 99% of the time, I don't believe it is. And even for this feature film, as I said, they're not using ProRes RAW. They're using the internal codec most of the time, And if there is the option to use an external recorder, they are, but that's just vanilla ProRes. And the reason behind that is the whole point of using this camera is because it's small, it's compact, it's very, very small. We can get into a teeny tiny space with it. As soon as you add an external recorder, that compactness is gone. So I don't think that there is a solution to not being able to get ProRes RAW into Resolve. If perhaps one day we can take ProRes RAW directly into DaVinci Resolve, then perhaps I will start using ProRes RAW. But your workflow is a combination of how you shoot. All starts with the lens, the quality of that lens, the quality of your sensor. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I really like the FX6. 6K oversampling, even though it's a Super 35 sensor. That oversampling gives this a really nice feel and texture to this image compared to the 4K sensors in the FX6 and 3. Record, with the best sensor that you can, with the right sensor. So you don't want to use 12,800 ISO if you don't need to on an FX3. Use 800 where you can. Then use the best codec that you can. And the best codec that you can directly get into post-production, in my opinion. So the XAVC or perhaps ordinary ProRes. And then it all comes down to your workflow and post-production. And editing-wise, there are obviously differences between Premiere and Resolve and FCP. But actually, Resolve now is a very powerful editing package. It can do most of the things you want to do. You've got two different edit ways of working. You've got the edit room and the cut only room. So if you're cutting quickly, the cut room is fantastic. And then you go to the edit room to finesse your edit before going to the grade. But really having a very, very powerful set of grading tools now is immensely important. I mean, you could just throw a LUT on your footage. And if you're shooting with ProRes RAW and just throwing a LUT on it, why bother? Because your LUT is going to break your image down into 33 or 65 steps. So it's not going to be a totally smooth image anyway. Yes, there will be interpolation and things like that, but if you're just using LUTs, there's no point in using RAW, frankly. Shoot with the internal recording. But if you're going to take the time to grade and to finesse your footage, you want all of those tools like power windows, being able to select very specific parts of the image, whether that's through color, brightness, whatever, and just grade those bits separately to other parts. That's a really immensely important part of grading as opposed to just applying global corrections. So use a proper grading package and that can transform your end result. It's as much about the power of your grading software as it is the footage that you shot. So it's all about workflow. Anyway, we've spent an immense amount of time on that. So another question that's popped up is, do I feel a big difference between the FX30, S35 sensor images and the FX6 images when cutting them together? Yes, I do. It's difficult to quantify because it's not black and white, but it's that when you oversample, and this is something that when Venice 2 was launched with its 8K sensor, and when I first saw the specs, I was like, oh, 8K sensor, blah, blah, who needs 8K? Nobody's going to be delivering 8K regularly anytime soon. I still think that is the case, that 4K delivery is going to be the norm for a very, very long time. I don't think 8K delivery is something most of us need to worry about, certainly not in the next few years. So I kind of poo-pooed 8K. Let's face it, Venice 1 had a 6K sensor. Then I saw the images from that 8K sensor. And I saw something that I hadn't really appreciated before, which was a smoothness to the image. And after a lot of testing and using the camera and everything else, I think it became clear that that smoothness came from oversampling. What we do have to remember is the FX3 and the FX6 have a 4K Bayer sensor. And the issue we have with the Bayer sensor is that the resolution won't be 4K because there's only every other pixel is green, every other pixel on one line is red, and then on the next line is blue. So your color isn't fully sampled. Your brightness information, which is mainly in the green channel, isn't fully sampled. So the resolution of these cameras is only actually about 3K, depends on what you're shooting. So you're seeing an image that's about 3K, often looking at it on a 4K monitor, And then there is a little bit of sharpening and things like that that goes in as part of that debayering process to try and make up for that shortfall in resolution. And that gives the images a slightly, and it is very slightly processed look. And in fact, the FX9 has a less processed look when you shoot at 6K, even though you're recording in 4K, because of the same reason. When you oversample, when you have 6K of pixels, you actually have enough pixels for a 4K resolution image. So you don't need to sharpen anything. You're not making up for a lack of resolution anywhere in your processing pipeline. And what that results in is, I think, more true-to-life skin tones is where I notice it. I don't see it necessarily as an image that looks sharper overall or is obviously higher resolution or anything like that. I don't see that. But what I do see is when I'm shooting faces and people is something about the skin tones that is just that bit nicer. And it looks less like a video image and more like a film image, for want of a better description. I struggle to describe this difference that I see because it's not something that's black and white. If I could just say it looks less electronic, perhaps that's what I mean, but that implies some big, huge difference. It's not. It's much subtler than that. It's a very, very subtle difference. But I definitely see it. I see it with Venice shooting at 8K or 6K. I see it with the FX9 shooting in full frame with the 6K mode. And I see it with the FX30, that oversampling, that having more pixels than your delivery resolution is definitely beneficial. And that's one of the things that I find very attractive about the FX30 image. And I'm not putting down full frame. Don't get me wrong. I like and I use and I shoot full frame. But I do kind of feel that full frame was quite a bit overhyped. Oh, we have to shoot everything in full frame because it's the only way you can get the filmic look and everything else. Yeah, full frame does make it easier, generally speaking, to get a shallower depth of field. But other than that, there's nothing unique about full frame. Shoot Super 35 and it opens up a whole new world of possibilities. I've been using my FX30 with the Surui 1.3 times anamorphic lenses, and I love that look. I'm using it with these new Nightwalker lenses, and I love that look. I put PL lenses on, classic cinema glass, and I really love the way it looks. Does it mean I'm going to sell my FX3 here? No, because the FX3 in low light really excels. And at Glastonbury, I was shooting a lot with my FX30. There was another shooter there. The producer was shooting with the FX3, and those images all cut together just fine. And he shot some really amazing stuff at night in the outside areas that really the FX3 was the better camera for. So there's pros and cons to both cameras. There's things I like about both. And I'm lucky enough that at the moment I can afford both. If that situation were to change, if I could only afford one of these two cameras, that's a tough one. It really is. And I'm not sure I know. I would fight tooth and nail probably to keep both of them because they do different things for different purposes. I think, oh God, it would almost be the flip of a coin to decide which one to keep, because the FX30 for that low light performance is absolutely fantastic. I need my FX30 for the northern lights and for shooting outside at night. But then I do like the way the FX3 outdoors at night, low light. But I love the way the FX30 looks for more controlled lighting. And I think that's the thing, is the FX30, when the light levels do fall off, the performance of the FX30 falls off faster than it does with the FX3. So there's your trade-off right there. I think what I'd really like is an FX6 with a 6K sensor in it, a full frame 6K sensor. That would be very nice. One that's a bit better perhaps than the FX9 sensor with a bit less rolling shutter. But that doesn't exist, so we don't have that option. So I think I've answered all the questions. I think I've covered everything that I wanted to talk about in this last couple of hours. I hope the session has been useful to you. Thank you for joining. I'm going to waffle just for a little bit. Just in case there are any last-minute questions, because there's a little bit of time delay between me speaking, you seeing the picture, and then typing your questions in and me getting it. So I will waffle on for a little bit. I will remind you that this was supported by both Sony and Visual Impact, and I'd like to thank them for that. I can just see your questions just popped up. In fact, the question is, do I use S35 lenses on the FX30 or do I use a Metabones? I do both. And that is another reason why I quite like the FX30, is I can use native super 35mm lenses on it. The 18 to 105 that's on here right now is a super 35 lens. This little lens is about 800 pounds. It shouldn't be as good as it is for 800 pounds. Power zoom. If you don't use the internal corrections in the camera, there is a bit of barrel distortion and things like that, but with the internal compensation in the camera, you don't ever see that. And it produces a really surprisingly good image with a power zoom. And then I've got the Surui 1.3 times anamorphics, they're super 35 lenses, and I've used it with various PL mount cinema glass, which is mostly super 35, and it works great. I've also got some old EF lenses that I still have hanging around. So one in particular, which is the 20mm f1.4. That's a lens that I use for many years to shoot the Northern Lights. And it's a full frame lens, and I can use that with the speed booster on the FX30. And then, of course, it becomes equivalent to the f1.0 something lens, a very, very fast lens. So I can do both with the FX30. Just the other day, I was using a 70 to 200 as an EF mount one with a speed booster on the FX30. And it's one of the things that I like, is that flexibility actually to use both full frame and super 35. To do that on an FX3, the FX3 would have to have a 6K sensor, really, the same with the FX6. And maybe we'll see that in later generations. But right now, we don't have that. Yeah. Okay, no more questions have popped up. I hope I have answered anything. Again, thank you to Sony. Thank you for Visual Impact for supporting this. Hopefully we'll do some more. Perhaps we'll do some after IBC around September time. I have a very busy period coming out right now. Next month or so, I'm traveling around shooting all sorts all over the world and doing some Venice workshops in South Africa. So if anyone from South Africa is watching, a couple of weeks' time, I'll be down there doing some Venice workshops and things like that. So thank you for watching. Have a great day. Enjoy your summer, and perhaps catch up later in the year. Thank you very much.